Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are honored to have with us Dr. Chris Fonvielle. As a native of Wilmington, he has had a lifelong love of the state of North Carolina, as well as the American Civil War. That led him to spend a lot of time teaching, researching, and writing about the Civil War and Reconstruction, along with the history of Wilmington and the Lower Cape Fear. During all of that time, well, not all of that time, but most of that time, he was at UNCW. Upon Dr. Fonville's retirement in 2018, the Department of History at UNC Wilmington gave him the honor of Professor Emeritus status, and Governor Cooper presented him with the Order of the Longleaf Pine for distinguished service to the state of North Carolina. We're proud to have him as one of the advisors for our board, as well as one of our very frequent speakers and tour guides. Let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Chris Fonvielle.
Tours at Fort Anderson, but it's Jim McKee next time. But y'all have fun. Jim's a good guy. It's great to be back with y'all again. I think I've spoken here, I don't know, half a dozen times. The round table was founded by Tom McDonald, whose wife, Kathy, is here tonight, and it's the first time that she's been here in many, many years, and I just want to thank her for coming. Of course, Wally Ruckel, y'all all know, founding member, Mike Powell, and Max Williams, the late Max Williams, and I was one of the charter members. So I've been coming and speaking to this group for as long as the Brunswick Civil War Roundtable has existed. And you know what, I think the most fun that I've had actually speaking to the ladies' forum, because it's always been me in a room of 100 women, and it doesn't get much better than that. And the last time I did it, we did sex in the Civil War, but the tech person ate my program, so I had to wing it. But that was an experience, and it was a lot of fun. I am here to talk to y'all about Wilmington's social history during the Civil War. I can't promise you that it will be as exciting as Game 7 of the World Series a few nights ago, but it'll certainly be more exciting than sitting at home and watching the results of the elections come rolling in tonight. Okay. Some of this many of you will know, others perhaps not. According to the federal census, Wilmington was the largest city in the state in 1860, with less than 10,000 people. You just about fit the entire population inside Hatch Auditorium today. But it was, and always has been, a port. The most important seaport in North Carolina from colonial days to today. And it, of course, is located 20 miles up the Cape Fear River from its mouth at Old Inlet, right outside our door here. So the channel is often intricate and difficult to get up to the State Ports Authority. So it has had its issues in the past, but what really made it was during the antebellum days, the coming of the railroad. And the first major railroad in North Carolina was the Wilmington and Wilmington Railroad, which ran from Wilmington to Goldsboro to Weldon, basically Rocky Mount, where it connected with the Petersburg and Weldon Railroad, which I'll come back to. But there were three major railroads that tapped into Wilmington in antebellum days, and that improvement in transportation is really what catapulted Wilmington, its growth and development, not unlike the completion of I-40 in 1990. And the growth around here has been just exponential as more and more people from all over the country moved to this area, because y'all have discovered what those of us who were born here already knew, what a great place it is. The river was navigable all the way to Fayetteville, 90 miles upstream, so as long as you had flat-bottom steamboats or barges or lighters, you could do trade and commerce up and down the river and the northeast Cape Fear River. So that's really what made Wilmington, were those improvements in information and communication. And the big industries from colonial days, not rice and indigo, although those were commodities that were grown here, but it was naval stores and lumber that were the big drivers in the industries during colonial times and the antebellum days. And of course, that wealth of the town is evidenced in our fine public buildings, some of which stand today, like City Hall, Failing Hall. Well, it's no longer City Hall now. The city recently bought a $68 million building and moved from the front of this building into this mammoth new building, which had been the city offices since 1858. Of course, we've also got beautiful antebellum homes like the John D. Bellamy Mansion at 5th and 5th Avenue. All the other ones are streets. That one's Avenue and in Market Street, which of course is open to the public. But then of course you had working class whites and African Americans who were marginalized, who lived on the fringes of society, and that included Wilmington. Even though Wilmington's population was more than 40% African American. Now 95% would have been enslaved, but almost half the population of Wilmington were African American. Now everything changed, as y'all know, during the Civil War. As a result of President Lincoln's proclamation of a naval blockade to try and prevent southern seaports, southern states, from trading with Europe. Great Britain, France, Germany particularly greatly desired high-quality southern cotton, which of course became the big export of the day. And of course they were going to have to smuggle supplies in through the Union naval blockade to sustain any kind of war effort. Now, Union blockaders did not start appearing off the Cape Fear coast until mid-July of 1861, even though President Lincoln thought the war would be over in about 90 days. Remember, the first troops he called up were 90-day troops. Most Americans thought that 90 days, one big battle, then the madness would stop. It's kind of like the government shutdown. I mean, how much longer can they go? But the Confederate response, of course, to the naval blockade was using Confederate commerce vessels or blockade runners to try and run or pierce the blockade to bring in very valuable supplies. It was a very lucrative trade if you were successful. Remember, how was it that Rhett Butler made his fortune in Gone with the Wind? And I can mention him in the movie because y'all are an audience that will know who I'm talking about. I retired in part because my students no longer knew Gone with the Wind or Rhett Butler. But Rhett Butler made his fortune as a blockade runner, and then he got Scarlett O'Hara, and then he did give a damn, right? So Confederate blockade runners brought supplies indirectly from Europe by way of Bermuda and by way of Nassau if they were trading along the eastern seaboard, and then Havana if they were trading in the Gulf states. But for our purposes, it was coming out of Bermuda and Nassau. North Carolina was heavily involved in the blockade running trade. The state owned the Advance outright, and no, the name of the ship is Advance. It has nothing to do with Governor Zebulon B. Vance, as some historians have claimed. But she made 16 successful runs through the blockade before she was captured by the Union Navy in an outward run from Wilmington carrying cotton to Bermuda, and then turned into a Union blockader And what better way to chase down and capture speedy blockade runners than with a former blockade runner? So that was a fairly common practice by the United States Navy. And of course, what the blockade runners were bringing in, at least on government account, were military supplies, firearms, artillery, medicine, foodstuffs, anything the South could use to fight the war. And 50%, at least 50%, everything that the South used and consumed during the war was brought in through the blockade. So that's why blockade running was so important, and that's why Wilmington became increasingly the most important seaport in the South. Now, once those supplies got into Wilmington, they were sent to the needy either on the home front or on the battlefront by way of those three railroads that tapped into Wilmington, the most important of which became the Wilmington and Wilmington Railroad, which became Robert E. Lee's main supply route by 1864 and was known as Lee's Lifeline and eventually was known as the Lifeline of the Confederacy. Products were initially sold to retailers as usual business, but then eventually the importers figured out that they could make a lot more money by auctioning off supplies. And so on a regular basis, there would have been auctions along Water Street at various houses or offices like Michael Cronley's auction house. And what that did is it attracted investors and speculators from all over the South, and I personally think also from the North, because northern investors could come through the blockade to the southern cities to invest in these products. But that's a clandestine mission that we don't know that much about. So for the South then, blockade running was life-preserving. It helped the Confederacy fight far longer than it otherwise would have. James Sprunt, the chronicler of the Cape Fear, wrote in his book, Chronicles of the Cape Fear River, that blockade running was both life-preserving and death-dealing. What did he mean by that? Well, in 1862, the third steamship that attempted to get into Wilmington was the blockade runner Kate. So for the first year of the war, sailing vessels were used as blockade runners because the blockade was not effective, it was porous, and just about any kind of ship could be used as a blockade runner. But eventually, as the blockade tightened, as the United States Navy grew and captures became more frequent, then they turned to steamships to run the blockade. And the third steamship to run the blockade at Wilmington was the blockade runner Kate, coming out of Nassau. And soon after she docked at the foot of Dock Street, people started getting fevers that turned out to be yellow fever. Now, fevers, or agues as doctors called them at that time, were commonplace during the hot months, or what they called the sickly months. But yellow fever, of course, was the great scourge. And yellow fever soon appeared, as these newspaper notices say, by the end of September. What the reporters were saying is that, well, yellow fever is here and it's not decreasing. And in the same newspaper, there'd be an article about how warm and wet the summer had been and how bad the mosquitoes were. But they never made the connection that the mosquitoes were the ones that were transmitting the viruses. Because, of course, physicians knew nothing about viruses and bacteria as they do today. Now, I love this one. I just happened to find this comment from that time period about the mosquitoes. And this one just happened to be, called the Yankee mosquito. Blame everything on the Yankees. But I love this. A new mosquito has been invented recently in these parts. It's reported by the Wilmington Daily Journal in the summer of '62, just prior to the Kate's arrival, just 4 days before the Kate got to Wilmington. This mosquito, while screwing its bill, sings Yankee Doodle and other anti-Confederate air through its hind legs. I love that. This became the city of the dead. Deaths occurred so often that if you could afford to, you got out of town. In fact, authorities encouraged people to leave. But what about working class whites? What about African Americans? Those were the people who bore the brunt of the virus because they couldn't afford to leave. And ironically, in some cases, elite whites, like Dr. Armand John Derzette, who built that beautiful antebellum home that is now the City Club at 2nd and Dock Streets, he left his home and property in the care and management of some of his enslaved people. That's how much he trusted them. We have a letter from one of them writing to the Derzettes who took refuge in Hillsborough, saying that many of the enslaved people at the Derzette house had been sick with yellow fever, but they had no recourse. They had nowhere to go. But just interesting that you had that kind of relationship between slave owners and their bonded people. Now, from Charleston came the Sisters of Mercy from the Catholic convent in Charleston, and they came up here and cared for the victims. Many of them became victims themselves. Dr. Robert Drain from St. James Episcopal Church died of yellow fever in October of 1862. Dr. James Dixon, he stayed. The physicians or the doctors and the ministers all stayed to care for those who were sick and those who were dying, and they too became victims themselves. So Dr. James Dixon died, and the deaths occurred so frequently on a daily basis that many people could not receive proper burials, as did Dr. Drain and Dr. Dixon in Oakdale Cemetery. But many people were buried quite haphazardly on a hill in Oakdale Cemetery on public grounds that is to this day known as Yellow Fever Hill. And there are more than 400 yellow fever victims from 1862 that are buried on that hill, with very few of the graves marked because they were buried without the family or friends to know exactly who they were. We erected a sign in 2012 commemorating the yellow fever victims. But if you ever go to Oakdale Cemetery, and I do tours of Oakdale, I will take you by Yellow Fever Hill. It really is a beautiful knoll. Now, on the other side of this coin, the upside to the fever was that it offered African Americans, particularly enslaved African Americans, an opportunity for freedom, because there were fewer white people in town to serve in slave patrols or in the militia. And every white guy in Wilmington would have served. It was compulsory service in a militia unit or a slave patrol on a monthly basis. And with fewer whites in town to maintain social order, was the polite way of saying it, that gave African Americans an opportunity for escape. And one of my favorite stories concerns this young man. Now, he's an older man here. We don't have a photograph of him from the wartime. His name was William Benjamin Gould, a person of mixed race, the son of a enslaved woman owned by Nicholas Nixon of what is today Porter's Neck Plantation, and an Englishman by the name of Alexander Gould. Now, we don't know how they, the current vernacular is how they hooked up, what kind of relationship they had, but it did turn intimate, and from that union, brief as it may have been, was born William Benjamin Gould. He was well educated. He was a master artisan. He helped build the Bellamy Mansion, and we know that because he left behind an initial piece of plaster that was discovered 130 years later that perfectly matched his initials from a journal that he kept during the Civil War, because he made his way to freedom with 7 other fellow slaves. They launched a boat at the foot of Orange Street and rowed the entire length of the Cape Fear River, 28 miles to escape to freedom. And they were picked up by the USS Cambridge. William Gould promptly joined the United States Navy, and ironically, his first duty station was with the Cape Fear blockading squadron. And he served for the duration of the war in the United States Navy, and after the war moved to Dedham, Massachusetts, where he found a former friend from Wilmington, a young lady by the name of Cornelia Reed. They got married. They had 8 children, including 6 sons, all of whom served in the United States military, and that never would have been possible had it not been for that young man's escape. And that escape never would have happened had it not been for the yellow fever epidemic. So there really is a silver lining, right, in every dark cloud. Now, there would be regular slave escapes, but it was not anything that Confederate authorities liked to advertise for fear that it would inspire other enslaved people to try and escape. But I did discover that a body servant, as they were called, personal servant to Colonel William Lamb, who was Fort Fisher's commandant, was picked up by the USS Niphon off of Federal Point Beach in 1864. And of course, what this gave the United States Navy was information about Confederate defenses and troop strength, troop disposition, where these troops were being stationed. So they provided valuable information to the United States Navy, which made its way all the way up to the United States Navy Department. If they did not join the United States Navy, as Mr. Gould did, they might join United States colored troops. By May of 1863, as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, the United States Colored Troops Bureau was formed. And for the first time since 1793, African Americans were able to serve in the United States military, officially serve in the United States military. Before that, they served as laborers building Fort Fisher or Union defenses and mounting artillery, but they were not allowed to serve in combat roles, and now they do. And there would be 178,895 African-American young men, that's officially, who served the United States Colored Troops. And there would be 9 brigades of these U.S. Colored Troops who fought and helped capture Fort Fisher and then Wilmington. So African-Americans played a very important role at Wilmington during the war, as did the ladies. Now, they never had the benefit of my talk on sex during the Civil War, but then they would have known about it firsthand. They could have told me. Ladies served in a variety of roles, with most of them providing support efforts for the Confederate war machine. That is, that in every neighborhood, in every household, in every family, in every neighborhood, ladies would have gotten together to manufacture things that Confederate soldiers would have needed and used, from socks to shirts to flags to haversacks, which was basically a man's body purse where they kept their personal effects. So this, and of course, it inspired Confederate soldiers to see women doing for them, and really gave them more of a reason to fight the war. Because the average Confederate soldier didn't own slaves, and he wasn't fighting for slavery. What was he fighting for? And they would always say that they were fighting for their home and for their families. and for the ladies back home. One of the leaders in this effort was Mrs. Eliza Jane Lord Derazette, who was the wife of Dr. Derazette, who I mentioned just a little while ago. She formed the Soldiers' Aid Society, and she was so efficient. It was like the Brunswick Civil War Roundtable. It was so efficient, such a well-oiled machine that James Sprunt later said that she was so good that she ought to have been a general. So Mrs. Derazette was the leader of many of the efforts that concerned the ladies, and they would go to the railroad depots. Wilmington, remember, a railroad town, and you had cars coming in and out of the city on a daily basis. And when the trains arrived at what is today the Railroad Museum on the north end of town, where Cape Fear Community College is, there would always be a group of ladies there to hand out ham biscuits and fried chicken and iced tea and mint juleps. They would write letters for soldiers. They would comfort soldiers. They would tend to whatever needs they might have. Women were just absolutely instrumental in keeping the morale of the soldiers as high as they possibly could, which was important as the war turned against the Confederacy by 1863. Now, one of my favorite stories about women in Wilmington during this time concerned this lady named Mary Ann Bowie. She was from Fayetteville, but she moved to Wilmington during the war because as a seaport, as a blockade-running town, there was great money being made. These blockade-running firms often owned flotillas of steamships, and they were making money hand over fist. So where do you go to request funds for your philanthropic efforts? So she moved to Wilmington, and she went to the blockade-running firms, and she would ask for donations. Well, I only had this caricature of her that was done by a young poet from Maryland named James Ryder Randall, who later became famous for penning a poem called Maryland, My Maryland, that was put to tune. But prolific writer, and he wrote about conditions in Wilmington during the war, and this is where the story of Mary Ann Bowie came to light. And he drew this caricature of her and talked about how unpleasant she looked. And I searched for years for a photograph of her, and lo and behold, I finally found one. And I think James Ryder Randall was pretty close to the truth there. And here's what he wrote in 1863. Miss Bowie, who was known as the soldier's friend, she raised funds not only for soldiers, but for their families. Because with soldiers all fighting the war, who was going to provide for the family? And suppose the soldier got wounded, severely wounded, or killed. Who was going to provide for the family? There were no safety nets by the government to provide these services. So it fell to churches and philanthropic groups and people like Mary Ann Bowie. So, known as the soldier's friend, she was the great annoyance of William Crenshaw of Richmond, large owner of steamers engaged in blockade running. About 3 months ago, and he wrote this in October 63, so during the summer of 63, about 3 months ago, she told him that she wished his next ship to enter would be lost because he had rejected her request for donations. About 2 days ago, after this pious prayer, he did lose the Hebe. Wrecked off of Carolina Beach, the Hebe is still there to this day. She boasted of this vociferously. Last week, Crenshaw refused again to subscribe to her fund. She imprecated all kinds of vengeance upon him, reminding him of the Hebe and asking God to destroy the next vessel of his that attempted to pierce the blockade. Well, on last night, The old witch was gratified. Crenshaw's fine steamer Venus was chased ashore and burned precisely on the same shoal as the Hebe, and the Venus is still there to this day, too. So you did not cross these ladies if they came to you for assistance. But, you know, for most soldiers, they weren't that interested in the big issues between North and South. They didn't care about states' rights and nullification and tariffs and all of that. They were concerned about their place in the war, their comrades, their loved ones that lay left on the home front. And of course, these young men, the average age of a Civil War soldier was 25, but many of them were just 18, 19, 20 years old, and they're off for the first time. You know, in those days, most people never went more than about 25 miles from the place they were born. And here they are moving into states. They're from Alabama and Mississippi, and they're going north into Virginia. They're seeing places, meeting people they never could have imagined. And of course, they're wild and they're free, so in their off-duty hours, they're going into the cities to have fun. So it was about love and lust and meeting young ladies. So that was a very common occurrence, and particularly in all of the cities. And sure enough, all of the cities, whether they were Confederate cities or Southern cities that had been captured by the Union and under Union occupation, had a very difficult time controlling the sex trade that could lead to STDs that often were lethal. Unlike today, if you have an STD, penicillin usually takes care of it if you catch it soon enough. But there was no cure for gonorrhea and syphilis in those days. So military authorities tried to regulate the trade without much success. One of the stories I told at the ladies' forum when I was talking about sex during the Civil War was that out in Nashville, the Union commanding general tried to remove all the prostitutes upriver to Louisville, and he placed them on a steamboat called the Idaho. You can't make that up. It didn't work. They called the next steamboat back down to Nashville. But I found that in Wilmington, you know, the problems were the same. And I found a couple of great letters from South Carolina soldier whose name was Kennerly. And he's talking about the houses of ill repute in the area of what is today Patty's Hollow on the north end of town, where you can go to the German Cafe and, Patty's Hollow and Three Penny Gallery up in there. That was a pretty bawdy place during the Civil War, and found a couple of letters that he wrote that I found were interesting. They say there are a great many girls in Wilmington, but I know nothing about them. I seldom go there. Now, wait a minute. He just said they say, but yet he's admitting that he goes, but only seldomly does he go. They say they are very cheap, but if they cost nothing, it would be all the same for me. I would have nothing to do with them for anything in the world. So he's professing his, allegiance to his wife back home in South Carolina. Then the next letter, I would not have you come here. It would be the last resort in the world for me to see you. There is no place for a lady, there being a difference between a woman and a lady. Even in the town of Wilmington, there are very few ladies. They say most of them are bad women. I fear a good deal of badness is carried on here, but honey, I do not engage in such badness. Well, if you don't engage in such badness, why do you have to say you don't engage in such badness? I'd love to have heard that conversation when he finally got back home from after the war. Well, some of the biggest customers were blockade runners, these sailors who came from all over the world, and they'd cross the ocean and they got to seaport and they wanted to have fun, and they had so much money that they were able to rent some of the finest homes in Wilmington, including what is today the Burgoyne Wright House. And they said that that was party central. Anytime you went by there, no matter the time of night, the lights would be on, there'd be card games and cockfighting and women coming and going on a regular basis. The agents and employees of the different blockade running companies lived in fine style because they were able to afford these kinds of luxuries. Thomas Taylor, who was a supercargo agent with the Anglo-Confederate Trading Company, and they owned a ship called the Banshee, actually two Banshees, because this one eventually got called after the 8th run. And according to him, Wilmington was war-pinched and war-torn by 1864, that it had really gotten to be a pretty bawdy place. I would say that it was the Las Vegas of the Confederacy by then. Most ladies and gentlemen, the white Southern elite aristocracy, got out of Wilmington and refugeed in safer areas, and then Wilmington was taken over by the military and sailors and speculators and investors and crooks and thieves and con men. In fact, John Wilkinson, another blockade running sea captain, was very explicit about his description of Wilmington during the war when he said, the staid old town of Wilmington in the pre-war years, just kind of a sleepy backwater seaport, not nearly as active as Charleston or Savannah, but the staid old town of Wilmington was turned topsy-turvy during the war. The town was infested with rogues and desperadoes who made a livelihood by robbery and murder. It was unsafe to venture into the suburbs at night, and even in daylight, there were frequent conflicts in the streets in which knives and pistols would be freely used, and the civil authorities were absolutely powerless to do anything about it. And are we not having that same discussion on a national level today? So that's probably the best description, and there's more to it of Wilmington and what it had turned into by 1864. But it was also the most important city in the Confederacy for its survival. General Robert E. Lee said, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. So the message was clear that the survival of the Army of Northern Virginia, and thus the Confederacy, depended upon the survival of Wilmington, North Carolina as a blockade running seaport. So by then, not only was Wilmington the South's most important seaport, I argue it was the Confederacy's most important city. Now, Virginians will argue against me on this point, but I'm right, they're wrong. So I go back to that old saying that, North Carolinians live in the vale or the valley of humility surrounded by two mountains of conceit. Yeah. If y'all haven't heard it, you've heard it now. Well, the Union would finally attack Wilmington by way of Fort Fisher, and the two largest naval bombardments of the war and the two largest amphibious land, sea, Army, Navy operations of the war. Finally, there was a big attack, as you know, at Christmas of 1864. Oh, and I love this painting. This thing is huge. It's in the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts, or the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. It's about 8 by 10. It was done by Xanthia Smith, whose father painted the curtain that hung in Thalian Hall on its opening night in October of 1858. And that curtain is the only surviving original stage curtain in the United States. And his son did this beautiful painting of Fort Fisher. I love stories like that. And Fort Fisher finally fell in mid-January of '65. I've just completed a book with a good friend of mine, Bob Browning, called Fort Fisher Illustrated, The Art of the Battle. And yes, I bought copies tonight to sell. Looking at how much interest there was in Fort Fisher through the art. So we looked at every painting, every lithograph, every sketch drawing that we could find of Fort Fisher, and you'll be surprised how many there were. There was interest not just in the United States, but all over Europe too. We found Fort Fisher artwork in Germany and in France, and of course in England. But this was a Currier and Ives lithograph. We think of Currier and Ives doing these pastoral scenes, you know, winter, spring, summer, fall, but they did 2 lithographs of Fort Fisher. That's how much interest there was in the battles of Fort Fisher in the closing days of the Civil War and thereafter. Okay, another one of my favorite stories, and it's 7:54, so I've got 6 minutes. Okay, here I go. In 1980, when I was the curator of the old Blockade Runners of the Confederacy Museum at Carolina Beach, no longer exists. Today, that building is Town Hall. It was a magnificent, privately owned and operated museum dedicated to the story of blockade running at Wilmington. I went into a florist shop, Reader's Florist Shop on Dawson Street to buy some flowers for a girlfriend. I have to be careful when I tell the story because if my wife Nancy's with me, she was not the young lady I was buying flowers for. But she's not here tonight, so I can tell y'all. I was buying flowers for a girlfriend, and the man who waited on me discovered somehow, I don't remember, that I was working at the Blockade Runner Museum, and he said, "Well, Chris, I've got a story to tell you. My grandfather," and my name is Robert Horn, by the way, my grandfather, Hosey Lewis Horn, was a Confederate soldier, and he fought against his brother at Fort Fisher. And I've got a photograph of my grandfather, if you'd like to have a copy. Well, there it is. Nancy says he looks like Opie Taylor from the Andy Griffith Show. Don't get me started. I can quote chapter and verse, anything you want. So I had this photograph, and I had the story, family tradition, oral history, but that was it. I had no hard evidence. And then as I was researching what would become my first major book, I found this newspaper article in the Philadelphia Inquirer in February of '65. And in a long article about military operations during the Wilmington campaign, there was a little paragraph called "An Incident." And I don't know that you can read it, but basically what it said was that the Union Army was chasing the Confederates as they retreated from Sugarloaf near Fort Fisher to Wilmington. And the column got about halfway toward Wilmington when it rested, stopped to rest in the road. And a young officer asked permission to step out of line to visit the house by the roadside. And his commanding officer asked him what business. And the young officer said, "It is the residence of my parents and the home of my childhood." And soon the mother, the reporter wrote, soon the boy was clasped in the arms of his overjoyed mother, who said, "Your brother was here yesterday." He stopped to say goodbye as the Confederates marched past here. That mother has a son in both armies. And to me, that gave a lot of credence to the old Horn family story that had survived all those years. So I think it's true that those young men fought against each other at Fort Fisher, at Forks Road. They both survived the war. They both moved back to the Wilmington area, lived in the Monkey Junction area. And depending who I ask over the years, and I've asked for a photograph of the Union brother, whose name was Jacob Horn, and I've asked for information about their relationship in the post-war years, and depending on who I ask in the family, among the descendants, they either got along great or they never spoke to each other again for the rest of their lives. So, and there was their mother, Catherine Lanier Horn. They both fought at the Battle of Forks Road that is now on the grounds of the Cameron Art Museum. Remnants of the Confederate earthworks and the battlefield are still there. I've written a book about it called Glory at Wilmington. It's a fascinating little battle, and the last battle before Wilmington fell. And today, it is a PNC, United States Colored Troops park. And an African-American artist did this magnificent figure memorial to United States Colored Troops. It's the only one in North Carolina of its kind. And it's called Boundless. And these guys are marching up the original road between Fort Fisher and Wilmington and marching toward freedom. And it is magnificent. If you've not been there, go there. Call me and book a tour, and we'll do that. While the rest of the people go to Fort Anderson, we'll go to Forks Road. Okay, well, after Fort Fisher fell, blockade running, of course, had been closed, and that ended it for Robert E. Lee, as he predicted. No longer able to get supplies for his army by way of his Lifeline along the Wilmington and Wilmington Railroad. He had to evacuate his position around Petersburg, and U.S. Grant chased him and caught him and forced his surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April the 9th, 1865, exactly 46 days after Wilmington fell. So it really was the nail in the coffin for the Confederacy when Wilmington was no longer open to blockade running. It was not the end of the war in Wilmington. Soon after federal forces captured and occupied the city, there was a massive Union prisoner of war exchange at Wilmington. It was chosen as an exchange point because of the railroads that could get into the city, and prisoners from Andersonville, Georgia, and Florence, South Carolina, and Salisbury, North Carolina were shipped to Wilmington by the thousands. Many of them in terrible shape because of the malnutrition and the exposure that they'd experienced as POWs. Some died en route. It was a terrible tragedy, but they were freed at Wilmington. It overwhelmed the United States Army and Navy because they didn't have the resources to provide for their own branches of service. And those in Wilmington, especially freed African Americans, to provide for them. And now there are 10,000 Union prisoners of war that at least need temporary care before they are shipped to Annapolis, Maryland, for proper exchange. So you've got about 16,000 United States military forces. Say you've got 5,000 civilians who have remained in Wilmington after the evacuation. And then you've got 10,000 Union prisoners of war that arrived. You can see where this is going. And then you get African-American refugees. 25,000 that attached themselves to the coattail of Sherman's army as it advanced northward through the Carolinas en route to Goldsboro. And by the time Sherman's army reached Fayetteville on March the 11th, about 3 weeks after Wilmington had fallen, there were so many African-American refugees that they were becoming an impediment to his operations because he was having to care for them. So he released them at Fayetteville and told them to go to Wilmington, now occupied by the Union. Well, by late March, there were 6, 8, in some sources 10,000 refugees that show up. So suddenly you've got a city that was built to accommodate 10,000 people, and there are 35 or 40,000 people living in the Wilmington area, trying to survive in the Wilmington area. And imagine the want and the need and the squalor that existed in Wilmington. The African Americans were placed on abandoned farms and plantations and fortifications like Fort Anderson, where you're going to go tomorrow. I hope Jim McKee talks to you about the African American refugee colony there. If not, ask him about that. That was one of them. Bald Head Island was another one. But eventually the African Americans were sent south to the low islands of South Carolina. But this was a great tragedy in the last days of the war and the summer of 1865. And I'll close with this quote because I think it's appropriate. It was written by Lieutenant William Calder of the 1st Battalion, North Carolina Heavy Artillery. His great-grandson, great-great-grandson, is one of my lifelong friends. And I hate him because at 72 years of age, he still shoots his age on the golf course. I don't like guys like that. But look at what he wrote. As my comrades and I trudged through Wilmington streets during the evacuation in the pre-dawn hours of February 22nd, 1865, a death-like stillness surrounded us, as it would for years to come. And a thick pall of smoke from smoldering fires hung above our heads. Lights could be seen from but few windows, and these appeared to be the last rays of departing hope. And it was only just the beginning. 1898 was only about half a lifetime away, but the seeds of 1898 were laid at the end of the Civil War in Wilmington. Now, that's only part of the story. I'll come back tomorrow night and we'll do part 2. Okay. Thank y'all.